Some people are not forgotten. They are erased, and no one dares to remember them again. The old clerk whispered, his voice barely louder than the scratching of ink against parchment, as the candlelight flickered across the vast ledger resting on the Duke's desk, its pages thick with names that defined who belonged to the world and who did not, and Adrian Blackwood stood motionless, his gloved hand hovering just above the paper as though touching it might alter something far beyond ink and law. While outside the tall windows of Blackwood Hall the winter wind pressed against the stone like a living thing, restless, searching, and uninvited. But inside there was only silence, heavy and deliberate, the kind that made even breathing feel like an intrusion. And then his eyes found it, a name violently struck through with dark lines that cut deeper than mere ink. Eliza Whitmore, each stroke deliberate, final, as if someone had wanted to make certain that no trace remained. And yet, something about it felt wrong, not the act itself, but the absence it left behind, like a space that should have been filled but was instead hollow. And his fingers tightened slightly, just enough for the leather to creak, as a faint, uninvited memory brushed against the edges of his mind. Something fleeting, a glimpse of a girl standing beneath a gray sky, her figure small against the cold, her eyes steady in a way that did not belong to someone meant to disappear. And the thought vanished as quickly as it came, leaving only a quiet tension behind, subtle but impossible to ignore. While miles away, beyond the reach of the estate and the order it imposed, a carriage moved steadily through a curtain of fog so thick it swallowed the road whole, its wheels crunching softly over frozen ground as though the world itself wished to muffle its passing. And inside, Eliza Whitmore sat with her hands folded in her lap, her fingers pale and still, her gaze fixed on nothing as the reality of her existence unraveled in silence. No farewell, no protest, not even a question, because questions required the belief that answers mattered, and somewhere along the way she had understood that they did not, that she did not, and the man across from her avoided her eyes entirely, as though acknowledging her would contradict the purpose of the journey, as though she had already begun to fade. And perhaps she had, because even the sound of her own breath felt distant, like it belonged to someone else, someone who had not yet been erased. And the carriage did not slow, did not hesitate. It simply continued forward into the unseen, carrying her toward a place where names were forgotten and stories ended. Without witness, while back in the dim chamber, Adrian's gaze remained fixed on the crossed-out name, the silence stretching until it pressed against his ribs, demanding something he could not yet name. And finally, almost imperceptibly, he spoke, his voice low, controlled, but carrying a weight that shifted the very air around him. Find out where she was sent. The clerk froze, confusion flickering across his lined face as though the request itself defied reason, because no one questioned what had already been decided. No one reached for what had been removed. And yet the Duke did not look away, did not reconsider, his eyes still resting on the space where her name had been, as if he could see something beyond it, something that refused to vanish. And far out in the swallowing fog, the carriage wheels faltered for just a moment, the faintest hesitation in their rhythm, as though the world itself had felt the shift, as though somewhere between being erased and being forgotten, someone had chosen to remember her. The carriage did not stop, but something in its rhythm had changed, a subtle hesitation that only the wind seemed to notice as it curled around the wheels and slipped through the narrow cracks of the wooden frame, carrying with it a cold that settled deeper than the winter air. And Eliza Whitmore lifted her gaze for the first time in hours, not because she expected anything to be different, but because something felt different, though she could not name it. Not yet. And across from her the man shifted uncomfortably, his gloved hands tightening around the edge of his coat, as if the silence had grown heavier, as if the absence of her presence had begun to press against him in ways he had not anticipated. And still he did not look at her, because to look would be to acknowledge, and to acknowledge would be to contradict the purpose of the journey. And the purpose was clear. She was not meant to arrive anywhere as someone, only as something that had once been. And so the carriage continued forward through miles of barren land, the trees standing thin and distant like witnesses who had chosen not to speak, while behind them the estate faded into memory, and with it any proof that she had ever belonged to a place or a name. Yet back within the towering walls of Blackwood Hall, The silence had shifted into something far less obedient. The clerk still stood frozen near the desk, uncertain whether to speak or retreat, because the order he had just received did not fit within the structure of the world he understood, and yet the Duke had not moved, his gaze still resting on the defaced name, as though he expected it to answer him, as though ink could explain why something felt incomplete, and slowly, deliberately, he closed the ledger, the sound echoing through the chamber like the end of a decision that could not be undone, and when he turned, there was no hesitation in his steps, no sign that doubt had ever existed, only a quiet certainty that unsettled even the air itself. "Prepare a carriage," he said, his voice calm, controlled, but carrying a weight that did not invite question, and the clerk blinked, startled by the immediacy of the command. "Your Grace, the roads are nearly impossible this evening, the fog alone. Then we leave now," Adrian replied, not raising his voice, not needing to, because something in it made resistance feel irrelevant, and outside, the wind seemed to rise in response, as though aware that something was being set into motion that did not belong to ordinary circumstance, while far ahead, the carriage carrying Eliza began its slow descent along a narrow path that curved through a valley swallowed in gray, the fog thickening until the world beyond a few feet simply ceased to exist, and for the first time since her name had been struck away, she felt something unfamiliar stir within her chest, not hope, not yet, but a quiet awareness, like the faint echo of being seen, and she shifted slightly, her fingers tightening against the fabric of her dress, as though holding on to something she could not define, while the driver urged the horses forward, unaware that the distance between what had been erased and what refused to forget was rapidly closing, and somewhere behind her, cutting through the same consuming fog, another carriage surged forward with a force that did not belong to the night, carrying a man who did not yet understand why he could not let her disappear, only that he would not allow it to happen. The fog thickened until even the sound of the horses seemed distant, swallowed by something vast and unseen, and Eliza Whitmore felt it before she understood it, that strange pull in the air, as though the world itself had paused to listen, and she turned her head slightly toward the window, though there was nothing to see beyond the pale gray void pressing against the glass. No landmarks, no direction, only the quiet certainty that she was being carried somewhere she did not belong, somewhere no one would ever come looking. Yet the feeling did not settle into acceptance the way it had before. It lingered, unsettled, like a thought that refused to be dismissed, and across from her the man finally shifted again, his posture tightening as he glanced toward the driver's seat, then back toward the empty space between them, as if he could sense it too, the subtle fracture in what should have been a simple journey. And without warning, the carriage slowed, not enough to stop, but enough to break the steady rhythm that had defined every mile behind them, and the driver called out softly to the horses, confusion threading through his tone as he tried to urge them forward. But the animals resisted, their steps uneven, their breath visible in the cold air as they tossed their heads against reins that suddenly felt too tight, as if something ahead of them had changed the very path beneath their feet. And then it came, not a sound, not exactly, but a presence, a shift in the air that carried weight, purpose, and something unyielding, and from within the veil of fog a second shape emerged, dark and solid, cutting through the gray like it did not belong to the same world, and Eliza's breath caught, though she did not know why, her fingers curling slightly against her dress as the first clear outline formed, a carriage, moving directly toward them with a speed that did not match the caution of the night, its wheels slicing through the frozen ground as though distance itself meant nothing, and before anyone could speak, before the driver could decide whether to stop or turn, the second carriage halted just yards ahead, its presence absolute, final, leaving no space for avoidance, and the silence that followed felt louder than any command, pressing against the edges of everything until even the wind seemed to still, and then the door opened, not rushed, not forced, but deliberate, controlled, as though the moment had already been decided long before it arrived. And Adrian Blackwood stepped down onto the frost-hardened earth, his figure emerging from shadow with a stillness that carried authority without effort, his gaze lifting once, directly to the carriage that held her, and something in that look cut through the fog more sharply than any light, because it was not searching, it was certain, as if he had not come to find someone, but to claim what had already been his to remember. And inside, Eliza did not move, did not speak. But the air around her shifted in a way she could not ignore, her pulse quiet but undeniable, echoing in the stillness as the distance between being unseen and being found narrowed to a single breath. And outside, the man across from her finally broke, his voice low, uncertain. "Your Grace, this does not concern you." But Adrian did not look at him, did not acknowledge the words, because they did not matter. Nothing did except the presence behind that door, the name that had been erased yet refused to vanish. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, unyielding, carrying through the frozen air with quiet command. Open it. Not a request, not a question, but something that made resistance feel impossible. And for a moment that stretched too long, no one moved, until slowly, almost reluctantly, the handle turned, and the door began to open, revealing the girl who was never meant to be seen again. The door opened slowly, the faint creak of its hinges cutting through the frozen silence, as though the world itself held its breath. And Eliza Whitmore sat exactly as she had before, her hands folded in her lap, her posture still, composed, untouched by the urgency that now surrounded her. Yet the moment her eyes lifted and met his, something shifted in a way neither distance nor denial could undo. Because he did not look at her with curiosity or doubt. He looked at her as though she had never been erased at all, as though the lines drawn through her name had failed to reach him. And for the first time since the journey began, she felt it clearly, that quiet fracture in the world that had been so certain of her disappearance. And the man beside her stiffened, his voice low but strained as he tried once more to reclaim control. "Your Grace, she has been lawfully removed. There is no error in the record." But Adrian Blackwood did not move, did not glance toward him, because the words no longer held weight. Not when the reality stood before him, undeniable, present, and impossibly intact. And he stepped closer, each movement deliberate, measured, until he stood just beyond the threshold of the carriage, the cold air curling between them like a barrier neither of them acknowledged. And for a moment neither spoke, because there was nothing that could be said to explain why this moment existed. Why he had come, why she had not yet vanished completely, and yet it lingered, stretched thin between them like something fragile and unspoken, until finally, her voice broke the silence, soft but steady, carrying no accusation, no plea, only a quiet truth that settled into the space between them. "You should not be here." And the simplicity of it struck deeper than resistance ever could, because she did not question his authority, she did not beg for his intervention. She simply acknowledged the impossibility of his presence, and something in his expression shifted, not visibly, not enough for others to see, but enough that the air itself seemed to respond, tightening around the words. He chose next, "And yet I am." His voice low, controlled, but carrying something beneath it that did not belong to logic or obligation, something closer to certainty. And her gaze did not waver, though a flicker of something unreadable passed through it. Not hope, not fear, but recognition of a different kind, the kind that did not rely on memory. And behind her, the man's composure began to fracture, his tone sharpening slightly as he stepped forward. "Your Grace, this matter has already been resolved. She no longer holds a place within the register. There is nothing to be done." And for the first time, Adrian turned his head, not fully, just enough that the weight of his attention shifted, and it was enough to silence the rest before it could be spoken, because there was something in that brief glance that made explanation unnecessary, something that made the outcome inevitable. And when he looked back at her, there was no hesitation left, no question waiting to be answered, only a decision that had already been made. "She comes with me." The words fell into the silence with quiet finality, not raised, not forced, but absolute in a way that left no room for argument. And Eliza felt it then, not as a command, not as an escape, but as a shift in the path that had been chosen for her, something that should not have changed yet had. And her fingers tightened slightly in her lap, the smallest movement betraying the weight of what had just been altered, because this was not how it was meant to end. She was meant to fade, to be forgotten before the night was over. And yet here he stood, refusing to let that happen, refusing to allow the world to complete what it had begun. And outside, the wind rose again, sweeping through the valley as though it had been waiting for this moment to break, carrying with it the unmistakable sense that something had been rewritten, not erased, not undone, but changed in a way that could not be reversed. And slowly, without looking away from him, Eliza Whitmore unfolded her hands and moved, stepping toward a future that had not been meant for her, guided by the only man who had chosen to remember her when the world had decided not to. The moment her feet touched the frozen ground, the world seemed to shift beneath her, not violently, not visibly, but in a way that unsettled everything she thought she understood, because the path she had been placed upon had ended, and yet she still stood, still breathed, still existed in a space that should no longer have held her. And Eliza Whitmore did not look back at the carriage that had carried her away from herself. She did not search for what had been taken, because something in her knew. It was already gone, and yet as she stood before Adrian Blackwood, the cold air brushing against her face, she felt something unfamiliar take its place, something fragile, uncertain, but undeniable, the sense that she had not been entirely erased after all. And he watched her closely, not with scrutiny, not with doubt, but with a quiet intensity that did not waver, as though confirming something he had already decided was true. And without a word, he extended his hand, not forcefully, not as a command, but as something deliberate, something that acknowledged the choice now resting between them. And for a brief moment, she hesitated, not out of fear, but because this was not how it was meant to unfold. She had been given no choices, no moments of decision, only silence and disappearance. And now, suddenly, there was this, a hand offered in defiance of everything that had already been written for her, and slowly, her fingers lifted, pausing just before touching his, as if the space between them still held the last remnants of the life she had been forced to leave behind. And then, quietly, she placed her hand in his, and the contact was simple, brief, yet it carried a weight that neither of them spoke, because it was not about touch. It was about something deeper, something that acknowledged her presence in a world that had denied it. And his grip was steady, controlled, not tightening, not pulling, simply holding long enough to guide her forward, away from the carriage, away from the path that had nearly erased her completely. And behind them, the man who had accompanied her stepped forward once more, his voice strained with urgency. "Your Grace, this will not be overlooked. The registry cannot be altered at will. There are rules that—" But the words faltered as Adrian turned slightly, not enough to fully face him, but enough that the authority in his silence carried more weight than any spoken command, and the protest faded into nothing, swallowed by the same fog that had nearly swallowed her. And without another glance, Adrian led her toward his carriage, the dark shape waiting just beyond the thinning veil of gray, its presence solid, unyielding, as though it had always been meant to arrive at this exact moment. And as she stepped closer, Eliza felt the faintest tremor in her chest, not fear, not uncertainty, but something else, something she could not yet name, because this was not a return, not a restoration of what had been lost. This was something entirely different, something that did not follow the rules she had been bound to. And when the door opened, revealing the dim interior lit by a single lantern, she paused once more, her gaze lifting briefly to meet his. And there was a question there, not spoken, not formed, but present nonetheless, and he answered it without words, his expression unchanged, his voice quiet when it finally broke the silence. "You are not leaving this time." And there was no force in it, no demand, only a certainty that settled into the air around them. And she stepped inside, crossing a threshold that had not been meant for her, while behind them the other carriage remained still, abandoned in its purpose, its journey incomplete. And as the door closed, sealing her within a space where she was no longer unseen, the world beyond shifted once more, the lines that had defined her fate no longer as certain as they had once been. And as Adrian took his place opposite her, the carriage beginning to move with a quiet steadiness that cut through the fading fog, neither of them spoke, because the silence now was no longer empty. It was filled with something new, something unspoken, something that neither of them fully understood yet could not deny, because somewhere between being erased and being remembered, Eliza Whitmore had become something the world had not planned for, and Adrian Blackwood had just chosen to keep her that way. The carriage moved with a steady rhythm that seemed untouched by the chaos left behind, its wheels cutting through the thinning frost as the fog slowly gave way to a dim, distant horizon. And inside, the silence no longer felt like absence. It felt like something waiting to be understood, and Eliza Whitmore sat across from Adrian Blackwood, her hands once again folded in her lap, but this time not from resignation, not from surrender, but from a quiet restraint, as though she were holding herself together in a world that had not yet decided what to do with her. And she did not look out the window. She did not search for the road or the direction, because for the first time, the path ahead was not something she had been forced into. It was something she had stepped into willingly, even if she did not yet understand why. And across from her, Adrian remained still, his posture composed, his gaze resting not on her, but not entirely away either, as though he were aware of her presence in a way that did not require constant confirmation. And the space between them held something unspoken, something fragile, something that neither of them seemed willing to disturb too quickly, until finally, her voice broke through the quiet, soft but clear, carrying a question that had lingered since the moment he had appeared. "Why did you come?" And the words did not accuse, did not demand. They simply existed, waiting, and for a moment, he did not answer, not because he did not hear, but because the answer itself did not come easily. It was not a matter of duty, not obligation, not even reason, and that absence of explanation unsettled him in a way few things ever had, and his gaze shifted slightly, finally meeting hers, steady, unwavering, yet carrying a depth that suggested something unspoken beneath the surface. "Because you should not have been erased," he said quietly, and the simplicity of it lingered in the air, not as a justification, but as a truth he had chosen to accept without needing to understand. And Eliza held his gaze for a moment longer, searching perhaps for something more, something clearer, but finding none, because what he offered was not logic. It was something else entirely, something that did not follow the rules she had been forced to live by. And slowly, she looked away, her fingers tightening slightly against the fabric of her dress, as if grounding herself in the reality that had shifted so suddenly. And the carriage continued forward, the distance between past and present stretching further with each passing mile, until the first outline of Blackwood Hall emerged against the pale sky, its towering structure rising from the landscape like something carved from shadow and stone, vast, silent, unyielding. And as it came into view, Eliza felt it again, that quiet tremor beneath her composure, because this was not a place she belonged, not by name, not by right, not by any record that defined existence itself, and yet she was being brought there, not as a servant, not as a guest, but as something undefined, something that did not fit within any known boundary. And as the carriage slowed, the gates opening before them without question, without hesitation, she realized something she had not allowed herself to consider until now, that being taken from one world did not guarantee a place in another. And when the carriage came to a stop, the stillness returned, heavier this time, more deliberate, and Adrian stepped out first, his movements controlled, precise, as though nothing had changed, as though bringing her here was no more significant than any other decision he had made. And yet, when he turned back toward the open door, his gaze found hers immediately, not searching, not uncertain, but fixed, and he extended his hand once more, the same quiet gesture, the same unspoken invitation, and Eliza paused, just for a moment, her breath steady but her thoughts anything but, because this step was different from the last. This was not about being saved from disappearance. This was about stepping into something that had no name, no place, no certainty. And yet, slowly, she reached for him again, her fingers brushing against his, accepting a reality that neither of them had fully defined. And as she stepped down from the carriage, the doors of Blackwood Hall opened before her, not in welcome, not in recognition, but in quiet acknowledgement that something had arrived that the world had not accounted for. And somewhere deep within its walls, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, because the girl who had been erased had just crossed into a place where forgetting was no longer an option. The doors of Blackwood Hall did not welcome her. They opened as if they had been expecting something unnamed, something unrecorded, and Eliza Whitmore stepped forward into the vast entrance, where candlelight flickered against cold stone walls, casting long shadows that seemed to shift with every breath, and the warmth inside did not reach her immediately. It lingered at a distance, as though unsure whether she belonged within it, and the servants who stood along the edges of the hall did not speak, did not move, but their silence was different from the silence she had known before. This was not absence. This was awareness, a quiet tension that followed her every step, as if they could sense what had been done to her, or perhaps what had not been done completely. And behind her, the heavy doors closed with a deep, final sound that echoed through the hall, sealing her inside a place that did not recognize her name, yet could not deny her presence. And Adrian Blackwood moved ahead without hesitation, his pace steady, unhurried, as though nothing about this moment required explanation, as though bringing her here was simply a continuation of something already decided. And yet the space between them remained, not distant, but deliberate, as if he allowed her the choice to follow rather than commanded it. And she did, her steps quiet against the polished stone, her gaze lifting only slightly to take in the towering ceilings, the carved railings, the dim corridors stretching into shadow, all of it vast, all of it untouched by the uncertainty that now defined her existence. And for a moment, she wondered if this place could hold someone like her, someone without record, without claim, without proof of belonging. And as they moved deeper into the hall, a figure approached from the far end, an older man with composed posture and careful eyes, his expression respectful, but shadowed with something unreadable, and he bowed slightly as Adrian stopped before him. "Your Grace, the arrangements for this evening are prepared." His voice steady, practiced, yet his gaze flickered briefly toward Eliza, just long enough to acknowledge her presence without truly understanding it. And Adrian did not follow that glance, did not offer explanation, his voice calm as he responded. "She will remain here." Simple words, but they carried a weight that shifted the air once more. Because they did not define her role, did not assign her place. They simply declared her existence within these walls, and the man hesitated, only for a fraction of a moment, before inclining his head again, accepting what had not been explained. "Of course, Your Grace." And with that, the question that might have been asked dissolved into silence, because in this house, his word did not require clarification, and Eliza stood there, just behind him, feeling the quiet shift ripple outward. Because this was the first time her presence had been acknowledged without being erased or dismissed, not defined, not justified, simply allowed. And it unsettled her more than the journey ever had, because uncertainty could be faced. But this undefined space where she was neither hidden nor fully seen, demanded something she had not yet learned how to give. And slowly, Adrian turned toward her, his gaze steady, not searching, not questioning, simply present. "You will have a room prepared," he said, his voice low, controlled, but carrying that same quiet certainty that had followed him since the moment he stepped into the fog. And she held his gaze for a brief second, the words settling into her without resistance, because there was no expectation attached to them, no condition, no demand, just a place. And she nodded once, the movement small but deliberate, as though accepting something she did not yet fully understand. And as the man stepped aside to lead the way, the long corridor ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, lined with doors that held lives, histories, names that had never been questioned. And she followed, her steps quiet, her presence undeniable, because somewhere within these walls, something had already begun to change, something that would not allow her to fade again. No matter how much the world beyond might insist she had never been there at all, the corridor seemed longer than it should have been, each step echoing softly against the polished floor as Eliza Whitmore followed in silence, her presence threading through a place that had never prepared for someone like her. And the man guiding her did not speak, his pace measured, his posture composed, as though he had accepted the situation without understanding it, which was perhaps the only way it could be accepted at all. And the walls around her held portraits of faces long remembered, names preserved in oil and frame, their eyes distant yet certain of their place in the world. And she felt it then, the quiet contrast between what they were and what she had become, because they had been recorded, acknowledged, secured in history, while she had been reduced to something that should not have remained. and yet she walked beneath their gaze as though she belonged among them, not by right, not by name, but by something else entirely, something that had not yet been defined. And when they reached the end of the corridor, the man paused before a door, his hand resting briefly against the handle as though considering something unspoken, before opening it with a quiet motion, revealing a room that was warm, prepared, untouched by the uncertainty that followed her, and he stepped aside, his voice low, respectful. "This will be your room." Simple words, but they carried a strange weight, because they offered her something she had not expected to receive, a space that acknowledged her presence without question, and she stepped inside slowly, her gaze moving across the soft glow of candlelight, the neatly arranged furnishings, the bed untouched, the window framed by heavy curtains that held back the night beyond. And for a moment, she did not move further, because this was not a place she had been assigned. It was a place she had been given, and that difference unsettled her in a way she could not easily ignore. And behind her, the door remained open just long enough for her to hear his final words. "If you require anything, you need only ask." And then it closed, leaving her alone within a silence that was no longer empty, no longer cold, but filled with something unfamiliar, something that did not demand her disappearance. And she stood there for a moment longer, her hands slowly loosening at her sides as the tension she had carried since the beginning of the journey began to shift, not fading, not yet, but changing into something quieter, something more uncertain. And she moved toward the window, her steps careful, almost hesitant, as though the room itself might reject her if she claimed too much space within it. And when she reached it, she paused, her fingers brushing lightly against the curtain before drawing it back just enough to see beyond. And the grounds of Blackwood Hall stretched out beneath the dim sky, vast and still, untouched by the chaos that had brought her here. And for the first time, she allowed herself to consider the question she had not dared to form before, not why she had been taken, not why she had been erased, but why she had been chosen to remain. And the answer did not come. Only the quiet awareness that somewhere within these walls, there was someone who refused to let her vanish. And the thought lingered, settling into the stillness as she turned slightly, her gaze falling back toward the door, as though expecting it to open again, though she knew it would not. Not yet, because whatever had begun between being forgotten and being remembered had not yet reached its end. And somewhere beyond the corridor, beyond the quiet order of the hall, Adrian Blackwood stood alone in his study, the same ledger resting before him once more, its pages unchanged, its ink still declaring her absence. And yet his gaze did not linger on the crossed-out name this time. It rested on the space beside it, the empty margin where something could be written again. And though no pen touched the page, though no word was added, the silence held a quiet defiance, because for the first time, the record was no longer the final truth, and within the walls of his house, the girl who had been erased was beginning to exist in a way that no ink could fully contain. The night settled over Blackwood Hall with a quiet stillness that did not belong to rest, but to something waiting, something shifting beneath the surface of carefully ordered silence. And Eliza Whitmore remained by the window longer than she intended, her gaze tracing the faint outlines of the grounds as darkness deepened, not searching for escape, not expecting change, but holding on to the fragile awareness that she was still here, still present in a place that had not erased her. And the thought felt unfamiliar, almost uncertain, as though it might dissolve if she acknowledged it too quickly. And behind her, the room remained untouched, every object exactly where it had been placed, as if it had been prepared for someone who belonged without question. And yet she had stepped into it carrying a presence that had no record, no confirmation beyond the quiet decision of one man. And slowly, she turned away from the window, her steps measured as she moved further into the room, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table, grounding herself in something tangible, something real, because the world she had left behind had not allowed her that certainty. And now it surrounded her in ways she did not yet trust. And across the hall, beyond the long corridor and the heavy doors, Adrian Blackwood remained alone, the dim light of his study casting shadows that stretched across the floor like silent questions waiting to be answered. And the ledger still lay open before him, its pages unchanged, its authority unchallenged by anyone but him. and yet he did not look at it the way he had before, not with expectation, not with acceptance, but with a quiet resistance that had begun the moment he saw her name crossed out, and his hand rested beside it, not touching, not altering, simply present, as though acknowledging that something had already shifted beyond the reach of ink. And the memory returned again, clearer this time, not a full image, not a complete moment, but enough to anchor the certainty he could not explain. A girl standing in the rain, her voice calm despite the storm, offering something he had not asked for, something he had not understood at the time, and the realization settled slowly, not as a revelation, but as something inevitable, that she had existed before this, not just in record, but in his world, in a moment he had not allowed himself to remember until now. And the weight of it did not disturb him, it steadied him, because it gave form to what had once been only instinct. And back in her room, Eliza paused near the edge of the bed, her gaze lowering briefly as if considering whether to rest, whether to allow herself that small surrender. But the thought did not settle, because rest belonged to those who were certain of where they would wake, and she was not yet that person, and instead, she moved toward the door, her steps quiet but deliberate, her hand lifting slowly as it hovered near the handle, not out of urgency, not out of fear, but because something within her refused to remain still, refused to exist only within the space she had been given. And when she opened it, the corridor beyond greeted her with the same dim light, the same silent stretch of stone and shadow. But now it felt different, not because it had changed, but because she had, and she stepped forward, not knowing where the path would lead, not knowing what she would find, only that she could no longer remain unseen, not here, not anymore. And somewhere at the far end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar, a faint glow slipping through the narrow opening. And though she did not know why, her steps carried her toward it, drawn by something she could not yet name, something that had begun the moment he refused to let her disappear. And as she moved closer, the quiet of the hall deepened, as though even the walls were listening, waiting for what would come next, because within these walls, the line between what had been erased and what refused to be forgotten was no longer as certain as it had once been. The door at the end of the corridor stood slightly open, the narrow line of light stretching across the floor like a quiet invitation that had not been spoken aloud. And Eliza Whitmore slowed her steps as she approached, not out of fear, but because something in the stillness told her this moment carried weight, something that would not easily be undone once crossed. And the silence around her deepened with every step, the distant echoes of the hall fading until there was only the soft rhythm of her breath and the faint glow waiting just beyond the threshold. And she paused just short of the doorway, her hand hovering briefly near the edge as though the space itself required acknowledgement. And then she moved closer, her gaze slipping through the narrow opening before she allowed herself to be seen. And inside, Adrian Blackwood stood beside the desk, the ledger still open before him, its pages illuminated by the steady flame of a single candle. And for a moment, neither of them moved, because the distance between them held more than silence. It held the weight of everything that had been undone, everything that had yet to be understood. And when his gaze lifted, it found her immediately, not startled, not questioning, but aware, as though he had known she would come, as though the space between being unseen and being present had already begun to draw her toward him. And she stepped into the room without waiting to be invited, her presence quiet but undeniable, the soft sound of her movement enough to shift the stillness into something more deliberate. And she stopped just inside, her hands resting at her sides, her posture composed despite the quiet tension that lingered beneath it. And for a moment, neither spoke, because the silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with something that neither of them had fully named. And finally, her voice broke through, soft but steady. "You remember something." And it was not a question, not entirely, but a recognition of what had already begun to surface between them. And his gaze did not waver, did not retreat from the truth she had placed into the air, because there was no reason to deny it. Not now. And slowly, he closed the ledger, the sound deliberate, final, as though marking the end of something that had once held authority over both of them. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same quiet certainty that had brought him through the fog. "Not enough," he said, and the simplicity of it lingered, because it was not a dismissal, not an excuse. It was an acknowledgement of something incomplete, something still forming, and she took a small step forward, her gaze steady as it met his, searching not for explanation, but for something more certain, something that could anchor her within this space that had not been meant for her. Then why does it feel like you knew I would not disappear? The words were quiet, but they carried weight, because they held the question she had not allowed herself to ask until now, the question of why she still existed at all. And for a moment, he did not answer, not because he could not, but because the answer did not belong to reason. It belonged to something else, something deeper, something that did not require full understanding to be true. And his gaze shifted slightly, not away from her, but inward, as though tracing the edges of something just beyond reach. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more measured, because something in me refused to accept that you could, and the honesty of it settled between them, not dramatic, not forceful, but undeniable in its simplicity. And Eliza felt it then, that quiet shift beneath her uncertainty, not certainty, not yet, but something close to it, something that told her she was no longer standing alone within the space that had been given to her. And she did not look away this time. She did not retreat into silence, because the moment had already changed too much to return to what had been. And outside the window, the night pressed against the glass, dark and still, as though waiting for something within these walls to take form, because the girl who had been erased now stood in a place where her existence was no longer questioned, only undefined, and the man who had refused to forget her now faced the truth that remembering her might change more than just her fate. It might change his as well. The candlelight between them flickered once, as though responding to something neither of them had spoken, and Eliza Whitmore did not move, did not step back from the space she had entered, because retreat no longer felt possible, not after everything that had already been undone. And the silence that followed his words settled differently this time, not empty, not uncertain, but heavy with something that demanded acknowledgement, and she felt it in the way her breath slowed, in the way her thoughts no longer searched for escape, but for understanding. And across from her, Adrian Blackwood remained still, his gaze steady, yet there was something beneath it now, something less controlled than before, as though the certainty he had carried into the night had begun to shift into something more complicated, something that did not belong to decisions alone. And slowly, she took another step forward, closing the distance just enough that the space between them no longer felt like a barrier, but like something waiting to be crossed. And her voice, when it came, was quieter than before, but no less certain. Then I was not meant to disappear. And the statement did not seek confirmation. It claimed something that had already begun to take shape. And for a moment, he did not answer, because the truth of it did not belong to intention or design. It belonged to what had already happened, to what he had already chosen. And his gaze lowered briefly, not in doubt, but in thought, as though tracing the line between what had been written and what had been altered. And when he looked back at her, there was no hesitation left. No, he said simply. And the word carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it did not just deny what had been decided. It replaced it. And Eliza felt it settle within her, not as relief, not as certainty, but as something steadier, something that did not shift with the world beyond these walls. And for the first time, she allowed herself to breathe without holding back, without waiting for the moment when everything would be taken again. And yet, even as that thought formed, another followed, quieter, more uncertain, because being allowed to remain did not answer what she was now meant to become, and she did not look away as she asked, "Then what am I here?" And the question lingered between them, more fragile than the ones before, because it did not ask about the past. It asked about something that had not yet been defined. And Adrian did not answer immediately, not because he wished to avoid it, but because the answer did not exist in the way she expected, not yet. And his gaze shifted slightly, not away from her, but toward the window, where the darkness pressed quietly against the glass, as though the world beyond still waited to reclaim what it believed it had lost. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter, more deliberate. "You are not a record to be corrected." And the words were not a title, not a role, but a refusal, a rejection of the terms that had once defined her. And he turned back to her fully then, his gaze steady, unwavering. "You are here because I chose not to let you go." and the simplicity of it might have been cold, might have felt incomplete, but it did not, because beneath it was something unspoken, something that carried weight beyond reason, and Eliza felt it settle into the space between them, not as an answer, but as a beginning, something that did not yet have form but refused to be dismissed, and she did not argue, did not question further, because the truth of it did not lie in what had been said, it lay in what had been done, in the fact that she stood here at all, and the silence returned once more, but it was no longer uncertain, no longer waiting. It was filled with something quieter, something that neither of them could yet define, but both had already accepted in their own way, and outside, the night remained still, but within the walls of Blackwood Hall, something had shifted beyond reversal, because the girl who had been erased was no longer asking whether she belonged. She was beginning to understand that her existence had already been claimed by the one man who refused to forget her. The silence that followed did not retreat. It settled deeper, threading itself through the space between them as though it had found a place to remain. And Eliza Whitmore stood there without shifting, without breaking the quiet that had begun to form around something neither of them had fully spoken, because his words had not given her a name, had not given her a place the world would recognize, and yet they had done something far more unsettling. They had removed the absence that once defined her, and she felt it now, not as certainty, but as a presence, something steady beneath the uncertainty that had once threatened to consume her entirely. And her gaze did not leave his, because there was no longer a reason to look away, not when he was the only one who had seen her, when she was meant to be unseen. And slowly, she spoke again, her voice quieter, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. Then the world beyond these walls still believes I am gone. And the statement lingered, not as fear, not as regret, but as a truth that could not be ignored, and Adrian did not deny it, did not soften it, because there was no need. And when he answered, his voice remained steady, unchanging. It does. And the simplicity of it did not weaken her, it steadied her, because it removed the illusion that anything had been undone outside of this place. And for a moment, she lowered her gaze, not in submission, but in thought, because the weight of that truth was something she needed to hold fully, to understand what it meant to exist in a world that had already decided she did not. And when she looked back at him, there was something different in her expression, something quieter, stronger, as though the uncertainty had begun to settle into something more deliberate. Then I exist only because you allow it. And the words did not accuse, did not challenge. They simply acknowledged the fragile line upon which her presence now stood. And for the first time, something in his expression shifted in a way that could not be mistaken, not hesitation, not doubt, but recognition of the truth she had spoken. And he did not step back from it, did not attempt to correct it, because it was real, because his decision had altered something that could not be easily defined. And yet when he answered, his voice carried a quiet firmness that refused to let that truth stand alone. No, he said, and the word cut through the space between them with quiet precision. You exist because you were never meant to vanish. And the difference was subtle, but it changed everything, because it did not place her existence in his hands. It returned it to something deeper, something that had existed before either of them had recognized it. And Eliza felt it then, that shift beneath her feet, the ground no longer as uncertain as it had been, because this was no longer about being allowed to remain. It was about being seen as something that should have remained all along. And the realization did not overwhelm her, it steadied her. It gave shape to something that had only been fragments until now, and the room seemed quieter for it, the candlelight steadier, the air less fragile, as though something within it had finally settled into place. And she took a slow breath, not out of relief, but out of understanding, because this was not a resolution, not an ending. It was the beginning of something that would demand more than simply being remembered, and she did not step away, did not retreat back into the space she had been given, because she knew now that she could not return to that version of herself, the one who had accepted disappearance without question, and instead, she stood where she was, her presence no longer uncertain, no longer waiting to be dismissed, and Adrian watched her in silence, his gaze steady, because he saw it too, the shift that had taken place not just in circumstance, but within her. And though neither of them spoke further, the moment held something undeniable, something that neither could undo. Because the girl who had been erased was no longer defined by absence, and the man who had refused to forget her was no longer standing alone in that decision. And beyond the walls of Blackwood Hall, the world remained unchanged, unaware, still certain of what it had already written. But within these walls, something had already begun to move against that certainty. Something quiet, something deliberate, something that would not easily be undone. Because once someone had been seen in the place of their own disappearance, forgetting them again was no longer as simple. As it had once been, the night did not end. It deepened, settling into the walls of Blackwood Hall as though it intended to remain, carrying with it the quiet weight of everything that had shifted within those stone corridors. And Eliza Whitmore stood exactly where she had been, yet nothing about her felt the same, because the absence that once defined her had been replaced, not with certainty, not with belonging, but with something far more enduring, something that could not be erased simply because the world had decided it should be. And across from her, Adrian Blackwood did not look away. Because there was no longer a distance between seeing and understanding, there was only the quiet acknowledgement that something had already taken root between them, something neither had planned, something neither could undo. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke, because the silence now carried meaning. It held the truth that had unfolded without permission, without explanation, and it did not require words to be real. And slowly, Eliza turned toward the window, her steps measured, her movement calm, as though she had already accepted that the world beyond those walls would not recognize her, would not call her back. And yet she did not feel the loss she once would have, because what she had gained did not depend on being remembered by everyone. It depended on being seen by the one who refused to forget. And she paused there, her gaze resting on the dark horizon, the faint outline of distant trees barely visible against the sky. And she knew, with a clarity that did not frighten her, that she could not return to what had been, not even if the world offered it back to her, because that version of herself no longer existed. It had been left behind in the fog, in the silence, in the moment her name had been struck away. And yet she remained, changed, not restored, but redefined in a way that did not require permission. And behind her, Adrian moved at last, not toward her immediately, but closer, the quiet sound of his steps enough to mark the space between them as something no longer empty. And when he stopped, it was not far, not distant, but near enough that the presence of him was no longer something she could ignore. And still, he did not reach for her, did not speak, because this was not a moment that required claim, it required acknowledgement. And after a moment, she turned slightly, just enough that her voice could carry without breaking the quiet that had formed between them. "If they come looking," she said softly, not as fear, not as warning, but as a possibility that could not be dismissed. And he did not hesitate this time, his answer immediate, certain, "They will not find you." And the words did not promise safety in the way the world understood it. They promised something else, something deeper, something that did not rely on records or names or recognition. And she held that truth for a moment, letting it settle, letting it become part of the space she now occupied. And slowly, she nodded, not because she believed in escape, but because she understood what he was offering, not protection, not possession, but presence. And it was enough, more than enough, because it was something she had never been given before. And the silence returned once more, but it was no longer uncertain. It was steady, filled with something quiet and unbreakable. And outside, the night stretched on, unchanged, unaware, still certain of what it had already written. But within the walls of Blackwood Hall, something had already been rewritten in a way no ink could capture, because some names are not restored by being written again. They are restored by being remembered when they were meant to be forgotten. And as the candlelight flickered once more, casting their shadows side by side against the stone, it became clear that what had begun in erasure had not ended in absence, but in something far more enduring, because some lives do not return to the world as they were. They return as something the world can no longer erase. And in that quiet, unspoken truth, Eliza Whitmore no longer waited to be seen. She simply existed, and for the first time, that was enough.